Volkswagen Polo. This is a car that has always had a soft corner in the hearts of the enthusiasts, but when it came to the actual buying decision, you probably went for a Maruti Suzuki or a Hyundai. Why? Because this was never the sensible choice. It was never as spacious as its rivals, it always felt a little dated, and given Volkswagen's network in India, it never really penetrated the market like a Hyundai or Maruti Suzuki. But given the fact that the Polo is not so expensive after all, there's definitely more potential to be realized from this car. Here we have with us the BS6 Polo TSI with the 1 litre turbo petrol engine and a manual gearbox, and we are going to tell you if the Polo still makes sense after all these years, 10 years of it being in the Indian market. This is your host Shop Toshi, you're watching Car Blog India, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button before we go ahead.
We have already addressed the Polo being a dated car, but I for one am still fond of the Polo's styling. It's quite a timeless design and one that you cannot go wrong with. The crisp, clean lines have a maturity to them that has aged well. With the BS6 update, Volkswagen has thrown in a new bumper, side skirts, and a rear diffuser, and it still looks just fine. My only complaint is the lack of LED DRLs, as that's a huge miss in these times. And that's particularly bothering because even the Vento gets LED DRLs, so why not the Polo?
Stepping inside the Polo, I wouldn't say the interiors have aged as well as the exterior. The dials feel like they're 10-year-old, which they are, and the interior design itself feels a little lackluster and uninteresting, let's say. It is, however, very well put together, nothing rattles, nothing thuds, and you genuinely get the premium feel in the way it's put together. The driving position is also particularly very nice. I, however, would have liked a little more tactile feel from the buttons and the dials in the way they operate, but otherwise, it's a pretty fine place to spend time in. The equipment list isn't the most generous either. This touchscreen unit is only a 6.5-inch unit, and although pretty small, it is pretty responsive and nice to use. It gets Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, but the lack of a rear-view parking camera, even in the stop-and trim, is a huge miss, I think. It, however, gets cruise control, and the Polo was one of the first hatchbacks in this segment to come with this feature. It even gets one-touch powered windows on all four doors, and I think that is a particularly nice touch. Another thing about the Polo is that it has never been very generous in terms of space. There is just adequate legroom and headroom in the rear seat for an average-sized adult, but even then, fitting three people in the rear seat can be quite of a squeeze. Let's try to start with the driving experience of the Polo, because if you're at all considering the Polo, it is because of how it drives. And I can tell you right from the word go, it really wants to be driven hard. This 1 litre TSI engine on the Polo produces 110 PS of power and 175 Newton meters of torque, which, by the way, were the best in class figures before the arrival of the new Hyundai i20 Turbo. Now, this being a 3-cylinder engine, there's obviously the noticeable 3-cylinder thrum in the way it sounds. It's also not one of the quietest engines because you always hear the engine whenever you come on the throttle. It is, however, not particularly irritating, and you can eventually get used to it, and you might even end up liking it when you're revving it hard. And when you do actually rev it hard, it's a really rewarding experience. The way the Polo gathers speed and pace, it always puts a smile on your face every time. Now, this being a turbocharged engine, there's obviously a little bit of turbo lag. Throttle responses below 1500 RPM are honestly quite dull. But the engine does not take much time to rev up, and once you pass that 1500 RPM mark, there's a clean flow of power and torque up to 2500 RPM. Eventually, when you go past the 2000 RPM mark, the acceleration is simply exhilarating and addictive. You naturally want to always keep the engine on the boil, and by the time you reach 6000 RPM, you're already doing serious speeds for most Indian roads. With the BS6 upgrade, the Polo got a new 6-speed manual gearbox. The earlier BS4 spec Polo had a 5-speed manual unit. I wouldn't say that the Polo has the best manual gearbox in its class. Some of its Japanese counterparts have better manual gearboxes, but by itself, it's a pretty fine gearbox to use. The gear ratios are very well spread, allowing you to rev the engine hard in each and every gear. The second gear is particularly very long. The gear ratios are very well spread, allowing you to rev the engine hard in each and every gear. The second gear is particularly very long. You can go from 20 to as much as 80 kph in just second gear. The clutch is again not the lightest. A Hyundai or a Maruti Suzuki clutch is typically more lighter, but let's say it's adequately weighted. However, in very heavy bumper to bumper traffic, when you're mostly modulating the clutch, it can get a little tiresome over an extended period of time. Okay, the rider handling department is where the Polo really shines. I can confidently say that there is no other car in this segment that handles quite as well as the Polo. The suspension is on the stiffer side, and the car remains extremely well planted at high speeds. Show the Polo some corners, and the car responds so beautifully. The front end bites so well, and you can turn in with great confidence. The car remains flat through corners. There's very minimal body roll, and that's when you really push it hard. The Polo also does not have a very large footprint, and that makes it feel quite spirited and agile. On the flip side, the stiff suspension does not give you the best ride quality. The sharper potholes and bumps are definitely felt inside the cabin. It still feels solid and sophisticated in the way it rides, but the damping isn't particularly comfort oriented. If the ride was a little more absorbent, it certainly would have been nicer. The steering on the Polo is also very nice. This flat bottom steering wheel feels very nice to hold, and it is quite direct and has a nice heft to it. This is electronically assisted steering, of course, and it's not particularly brimming with feel. Something like a Ford Freestyle has more steering feel, but it still is very precise and direct. You will be able to place the car exactly where you point it to. However, the steering can feel a little heavy in regular city driving conditions or when you are having to do 3-point turns. We talked about sensibility earlier, and fuel efficiency is again where the Polo is quite sensible. In regular mixed driving conditions, the Polo returns an average fuel economy of 15 to 16 kpl, and that's pretty nice for a city hatchback. And that's even when you're driving it hard. If you're driving it efficiently, the Polo can return a fuel economy of as much as up to 22 kpl, and that's pretty outstanding. The previous 1.2 liter TSI engine on the Polo, on the BS4 spec Polo, was not at all economical. If you drove it hard, you could even get a mileage of up to 6 to 7 kmpl, and so this definitely feels like a huge improvement. If it's easy on your pockets, it's certainly more sensible, right? So summing it all up, where does the Polo really stand? It is often compared with the likes of the Swift and the Figo, but they are a little more affordable than this. The Polo is also pitted against the likes of the Hyundai i20, the Baleno and the Altros, of which this is more affordable. This top-of-the-line petrol manual variant of the Polo is priced at Rs 8.08 lakh at showroom, and that's quite reasonable, given the fact that it's a VW and it feels like a premium and sophisticated car in the way it's put together. That price is very well justified. But what are the compromises? Well, if features and space are your priority, you should definitely look somewhere else. Styling is still something subjective, and you have to be fine with the fact that the Polo is a 10-year-old car. But the pros are something that you will not find in any other car, and that's driving pleasure, the premium feel of a Volkswagen, and of course, a very revered name in the enthusiast circle. If you really enjoy driving, and if you have a small family, the Polo makes for a very compelling buy. But answering the question about sensibility, if you are an enthusiast, isn't the Polo naturally the most sensible choice already?